In today's video, we dive into the heart of a jaw-dropping encounter that unfolded in a small town, where a female cop's power trip spirals out of control. What started as a routine interaction quickly turned into an intense standoff, capturing the attention of bystanders, and eventually the entire internet. The drama? A simple refusal to provide ID during a traffic stop. But what followed was anything but simple. As tensions rise, this officer's authority is challenged in a way that pushes her to the edge. With cameras rolling and people watching, the situation escalates fast, revealing a side of law enforcement that's often hidden from the public eye. And just when you think things can't get worse, she's forced to walk away in what can only be described as a asterisk walk of shame asterisk. But is it over? This confrontation raises all sorts of questions about power, accountability, and the balance of authority. Stick around because this isn't the end. In fact, it's only the beginning of a series of events that will leave you questioning the limits of law enforcement and personal rights. You won't want to miss what happens next. To understand what led up to this moment, we need to go back a few minutes. The traffic stop seemed completely routine at first. A car pulled over for a minor infraction, nothing out of the ordinary. But the driver, a calm, composed individual, decided not to comply with the officer's request for identification. Maybe it was the feeling of being unjustly pulled over, or perhaps it was the principle of standing up for their rights. Either way, they made a stand that caught the officer off guard. This wasn't a simple case of non-compliance, though. The officer, a no-nonsense type with years on the force, wasn't about to let it slide. She began to escalate the situation, quickly losing her cool as the driver remained calm and firm in their refusal. The tension between them grew, with the officer demanding ID again and again, her tone growing more forceful with every word. But it wasn't just about the ID anymore. It became about power, control, and who would bend first. As the seconds turned into minutes, the standoff only intensified. The officer's voice grew louder, more urgent, as she repeated her demand for the driver's ID. But the driver, unmoved, remained firm. "Am I being detained?" they asked calmly, their voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The officer's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening. She couldn't afford to look weak in front of the growing crowd. Each second that passed without her gaining control felt like a small victory for the driver. Bystanders murmured in growing disbelief. Some exchanged looks, sensing something was about to break. The air itself seemed to hum with the weight of the standoff. A few of them, emboldened by the tension, began calling out softly, almost an encouragement to the driver. "You've got this," one person whispered. Another, recording the whole thing, muttered, "She's just trying to intimidate you. Don't let her." But the officer, now visibly sweating, had crossed a line. Her backup still hadn't arrived, and each passing moment felt like a countdown. There was no turning back now. Her body language betrayed her frustration. She was losing control. The crowd, sensing her vulnerability, began to grow bolder. Someone shouted, "She's got no reason to do this." The officer's eyes flickered toward the crowd, and in that moment, she seemed to understand the gravity of her situation. The walls were closing in, and her authority, once firm and unquestionable, was crumbling before her eyes. The hum of sirens pierced the air, signaling the arrival of backup. The sound, once a sign of reassurance, now felt like a looming storm, promising to escalate the already charged situation. The officer's face flushed red with anger, but it was also clear she was desperate. She needed control, and she needed it fast. With the backup now just a few moments away, the driver's calm demeanor remained unbroken. Their eyes never left the officer's, silently daring her to make the next move. Every second that passed felt like it was building to something massive, something that would either shatter the officer's authority completely or force the driver to back down. The backup car finally pulled into view, the lights flashing bright against the darkened street. The officer's hand twitched toward her belt, but she hesitated. But now there was something more, something like a secret. The stakes had just been raised, and the truth behind this moment, this confrontation, was starting to feel far more complex than anyone had anticipated. What was this man's connection to the situation? And would his arrival tip the balance one way or the other? The crowd was on edge, and the officer was visibly rattled. Something big was coming, and no one knew how it would unfold. The suited man stopped just a few feet away from the officer, and the air seemed to crackle with tension. The crowd was frozen, waiting for what would happen next. The officer's breath hitched as the man looked at her, his eyes cold and calculated, almost like he was sizing her up. There was a long pause, the kind where every person present felt like they were holding their breath. Finally, the man spoke, his voice low but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Step away from the vehicle, officer." It wasn't a request. It wasn't even an order. It was a command. The officer's face tightened, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her expression. She glanced over at her backup, but neither of the officers moved, uncertain, hesitant. They had no idea who this man was or why he had arrived, but the authority in his voice was undeniable. For a moment, the officer stood still, trying to process what was happening. Her hand was still hovering near her belt, but she seemed to lose all confidence. With the weight of the crowd's eyes on her and the unfamiliar authority of the man before her, her stance faltered. Finally, she spoke, though it was barely above a whisper. "Who the hell are you?" The suited man didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced at the driver, who by now had stepped back slightly but still stood firm. Then, without warning, the man pulled out a badge from his coat pocket. The officer's eyes widened as she took in the silver emblem, Internal Affairs. The realization hit her like a wave. She had been under investigation for months. Her power plays, the complaints filed against her, the subtle abuses of authority, Internal Affairs had been keeping an eye on her for far longer than she realized. The backup officers exchanged nervous glances, and for the suited man stood his ground, his jaw tight as he faced the officer's superior. The tension between them was palpable, a standoff that hinted at deep-rooted corruption within the system. But the superior officer, unlike the others, didn't flinch. He was part of the old guard, the ones who often played both sides. Yet in that moment, it was clear his loyalty was to the badge, no matter how murky the waters had become. "You'll get your turn," he said, his voice cold. "But not today." The suited man gave a sharp nod, signaling to his team to move in. Without another word, the officer was escorted away, her head held low. The crowd that had been watching in silence started to disperse, the weight of the event settling in. No one spoke. There were no cheers, no jeers, just the sound of footsteps fading into the distance. As the driver slid back into their car, they looked one last time at the scene unfolding behind them. They hadn't just refused to hand over their ID. They had exposed a deeper layer of abuse, one that would eventually be unraveled, piece by piece. The truth was out, and while this chapter had closed, the larger story was just beginning. The system might have won this round, but change was inevitable. The road to accountability had only just begun.